Thank you very much. TiECon Kerala is part of the international TiE organization. I'm familiar with it because my daughter and son-in-law are settled in Boston, Massachusetts, and they are part of it. And I've seen TiE organizations in various parts of the world. So I feel privileged that on this occasion of your Kerala summit in 2019, you asked me to come and speak and given me a saucy title to deal with $5 trillion in 2024. Well, I'll weave my talk around it and making that as an example. Our GDP is today about half that, a little more than half that, but it's in a 5 years period, that is on May 26th, 2019, our GDP was $2.5 trillion. And now in 2024, if it is to go to $5 trillion, it means doubling. And economists, especially those who deal with quantitative methods in economics, know that the rate of growth that you need for doubling is taken as 72 divided by the number of years. So if it's 5 years and 72, it is 72 divided by 5, the rate of growth that is required is 14.4% per year. Now, I had raised this issue with the government that how can you, when you're barely growing even at 6% now, how are you expecting to grow on an average for 5 years of 14.4%? And I was given what I would call as a shocking reply, that the 5 trillion is in current prices. Now, this means that if the inflation is run out of control, you will achieve that. Why in 5 years? You'll achieve in two years. In constant prices, there has been a decline in the growth rate in the last 5 years and plus, and this is very distressing. We began our, after independence, obtaining independence, we've spent 40 years adopting an out-of-date technology, an out-of-date model called the Soviet economic model, and could not exceed 3.5% per year. And not only we could not exceed it, but the parameters that were assigned to the Soviet economic model between 1950 and 1990, those 40 years, essentially ended up was around the assumption that the agriculture would give resources for financing industrialization. And agriculture was already bone dry because the British had set up this jamindari system by which all the resources were extracted and a part of it given to Britain for financing its administrative experience. And so agriculture was in no position to finance industrialization. And we ended up in 1965 with a food shortage, which is partly induced by the drought of that period, and literally had to wait for ships from the United States to bring PL 480 under the PL 480 scheme. But fortunately, we had a new Prime Minister then, Lal Bahadur Shastri, and he called experts like M.S. Swaminathan and others, and they put, and some of foreign experts too, from the United States of America and Philippines, and put together a package which led to what is called the Green Revolution. Green Revolution only reached about 10% of the agricultural population, but that 10% was enough to generate a very high growth rate in agriculture, especially in food grains. And by 1975, we became food exporting country. But still the growth rate of 3.5% continued because of the fact that the licenses and quotas and so on were hampering business enterprise. Unfortunately, after 1990, when we had a foreign exchange crisis, in which period I had just become minister in Mr. Chandrasekhar's government. I also held a minister rank position in Mr. Narasimha Rao's government. And during these two tenures, we decided that market economy is the best suited for a country like India, and dismantled the Soviet economic model apparatus of licenses, quotas, and so on. And that's how, in the 5 years of Narasimha Rao's period, we rose by the final year to 8% growth rate. And after that, there hasn't been radical reforms with the other prime ministers like Deve Gowda and Inder Gujral and Atal Bihari Vajpayee. And surprisingly, the finance minister of Mr. Narasimha Rao, Manmohan Singh's tenure as prime minister, also did not produce any radical changes in the economic system or further reform in the system. And so we never crossed that 8% mark again. And which of course means that Manmohan Singh was very good as finance minister if he had a capable prime minister like Narasimha Rao. But even as prime minister, with Ms. Sonia Gandhi hovering around him, he was not able to produce any major economic reforms. So and then came the BJP period. In BJP period also, we did not make any major reforms. The prime minister was, of course, by inclination, considering himself only devoted to microeconomic projects like Ujwala and things like that, which dealt with lavatories for the rural areas and so on. These were microeconomic projects. But what requires reforms in our country is macroeconomics. And most important of all, if we are to solve the problem of unemployment and lift bulk of our people who are under the poverty line, above the poverty line, then we need to grow at 10% per year for 10 years. In that case, we'll be able to do it, provided we make sure that agriculture also is reformed, which is a reform which we have never done since 1947. There's been no agricultural reform. There was a negative agricultural reform, which was the land reform under the influence of the left-wing socialist elements and the communists. But there's never been a positive, empowering reform in the agricultural sector. So we have now to think in those terms, because all the accumulated baggage of the last 20 years have now piled upon and become as a major crisis for us. We are now every day getting news, very depressing news. And most of the news revolves around the question of demand being weak in the country, that the demand factor is weakening. And unless you recognize that in a macroeconomic system, the interactions, the interlinks of industries and various sectors of the economy, you will continue to make mistakes as we have been doing. For instance, for some years we had a person called Raghuram Rajan as a governor of Reserve Bank, and he kept on raising interest rates. And his argument was, he was not an economist. He was a finance graduate from MIT and IIT graduate, IIT Delhi graduate. And his view as a finance man, was all bilateral. And finance is mostly bilateral. But economics is multilateral. So he kept on raising the interest rates on the plea that inflation was pushing hard and it had to be controlled, and therefore he had to control the money supply. But what really happened is that the rising interest rates meant the cost of capital for small and medium industries rose, and that led to collapse of the small and medium industry. And you today are discussing startups. Startups also are squeezed by the high rate of interest. So the unintended consequences or unforeseen circumstances by Mr. Raghuram Rajan was that the economy was getting bad, and perhaps he was able to put a control on inflation. And that's like a doctor who found that the patient's temperature was continuously rising. So he thought the only cure is to kill him. That's the only way to bring down the temperature. And that is something like what Mr. Raghuram Rajan was doing. Fortunately, he was asked to go home. Not that things have much improved since then. But I would say that today we must learn to focus on the general equilibrium of the economy. And then only we can think in terms of such ambitious targets as $5 trillion. And $5 trillion is not beyond our reach. It will, in real terms, it will not take more than 10 years, and perhaps even less. But if we grew at 10% per year for 10 years, then our country will become a developed country. It will overtake China, because China's model is now become obsolete. The model on which China grew for the from 1980 to 2015, that model is now become obsolete because it was based on importing semi-processed goods from East Asia, adding value, and then exporting it to the United States and Europe. And East Asia could not directly do it because their labor costs had gone up. So therefore, the Chinese skilled labor's low wages helped East Asia also to earn. So if you look at the Chinese foreign trade data, you'll see that they were in perpetual deficit in trade with East Asia, but in a huge surplus in the budget, the foreign exchange budget with the West. So they were paying the East Asians, adding value. For instance, Lenovo would send the circuit would come from Taiwan, and then in China they would put the keyboard and the screen and the cover, and then put made in China Lenovo, and then exported it. That model is now become out of date for China because Chinese labor has also become expensive. India has an opportunity there, but then we have to do many other things like improving our infrastructure and our multiple complex tax structure. It's very difficult to go from one part of India to another part of India in freight traffic without meeting all kinds of objections. So India can become a developed country before 2050. India can challenge the United States by 2050. But we need now to think in terms of what kind of a model we should adopt. And the model will always have 4 clear sections. One would be your objectives, the other would be your priorities, the third would be the strategy you're going to adopt, and fourth would be the resource mobilization. In my opinion, I'll start with the last, resource mobilization. In this country today, because we are having a demand problem, not a supply problem, therefore, we should take those steps by which people are empowered to have a greater purchasing power. And some of it which has been hampering the country's mobilization of savings, that needs to be dealt with. Recently, the government of India gave big concessions to companies on taxes. But that's at the wrong end, because companies are suppliers. We need this kind of tax concessions on the side of demand. And that would mean, in my opinion, personal income tax should be completely abolished, because this has become now a nightmare for most people. And you can always raise resources by other means. For instance, after my Supreme Court case on 2G spectrum, 2G spectrum, as I demanded, should be auctioned and not given away. As a consequence, we are getting almost 4.5 lakh crores from spectrum, and spectrum is not an one-time matter. You have 2G spectrum, the 3G spectrum, 4G spectrum, and now for 5G spectrum, and research is already going on 6G spectrum. So therefore, you would get every year a amount which will be almost equal to the personal income tax amount of 4 lakh crores. And similarly, coal blocks. There are many areas where we are not pricing our products according to the market, and that would give you alternative sources of revenue, and therefore we shouldn't think in these old orthodox method of putting taxes. So income tax would be a big thing in the financial sector. Second would be to ensure that the rate of interest paid on fixed deposits of 5 years and more is raised to 9%, and the rate of interest on loans, that should be not more than 9%. If we do this, then the financial market and the flow of funds will start, and that will be a factor in our defense. So in this kind of thing, and then you can go into the medium-term planning, and you see, it is quite clear from a study of all Western countries which have become developed countries, how their economy grew. It was not by more savings and deployment of more labor. It was by introducing new innovations. As you know, the first innovation was in the Industrial Revolution was the locomotive and the Bessemer steel plant, and then slowly wireless, electric bulbs, etc., then jet engines, then fax machines, and then the internet. And these have made huge differences. In the future, countries like India can go in for innovation in desalination of seawater. They can go in for thorium to be converted to uranium. And we have in our country 60% of the world's thorium. So that would mean abundance in the creation of power. But it requires cracking the difficulty we are having, that thorium cannot immediately be converted to uranium. And for that, there's a three-part process in which, during Homi Bhabha's time itself, we had got over two stages. But after the signing of the US agreement on nuclear assistance and cooperation, we have stopped the research on thorium, and that should be begun. So in all, what we find is that India, there's unlimited possibilities. Desalination of seawater is so easy now. The Israelis are doing it. The Israelis invented it. Now, clandestinely, the Saudi Arabians are also buying equipment from the Israelis, even though they don't have any relations. And the Israelis are great friends of ours. They could easily give it to us. And then there will be no problem. And many of our political problems also get solved. Every year, I'm harassed by questions in Tamil Nadu as to what my stand as a Tamilian is on Kaveri water. So I finally decided to ask the reporters a question in return. I said, you want my stand on Kaveri water? I want to first ask you whether you want water or you want Kaveri water. If it is water, I can make arrangements through desalination of seawater. Whereas Kaveri water, you're not going to get a drop, because there's not much water left for Tamil Nadu. So the politicization of this thing would immediately end. And today we have examples of desalination of seawater in our country. The nuclear facility of Kalpakam, their residents all getting water, drinking water from desalination of the Bay of Bengal. And similarly, in the case of the Reliance factory, refinery, oil refinery in Jamnagar, they are producing water for the unit through desalination, and also selling it to the Jamnagar municipality, which doesn't have water. So there's unlimited possibilities for India to liberate itself. Agriculture, all the prices of agriculture products are all much lower than almost all countries. Take rice, the good quality basmati rice of a similar quality in Japan is 1/6 the price in Japan, and 1/5 the price in South Africa. Why are we not exporting it? But it's not being done. We do export basmati rice, but that's for overseas Indians who live in Dubai and who live in America and these places. But as a project, as an export item, it will greatly benefit the farming community. Milk is 1/6 the price in Europe, and our cow milk, which is now called A2 milk, is far more medicinally valuable than the milk that you get in the Western world. So there is no limit to capacity. India is the only country, I know, large country, which can have agricultural activity all 12 months of the year. In the United States, 5 months snowfall is there. So only 7 months they are able to carry out agricultural activity. Same thing with Europe. But India, you can do it. You can grow 3 crops a year. But we are only growing in 25% of the land more than 1 crop. So it's all gross underutilization. And finally, the innovators are the younger generation. And we have the youngest population of all the big countries. Our average age of Indian is only 26. And 70% of our population is below the age of 35. Whereas the average age of the Chinese, because of their 1 child per family craze that they had, it's now 35. And in Americans it's 37. Europe it is 46. And Japan is 50 years. It's an aging population. So ours is the young population, which if we put through a good education, we would be able to have lots of innovations. And the Indians are performing very well in so many countries. Some people jokingly say Indians are performing very well all over the world except in India. So the question is why? And it's because of the fact that our focus on innovation now. Because otherwise, more capital, more labor will only take you along the curve, which means the law of diminishing returns will start working. So you have to jump from curve to curve, and that can be only possible by innovation. So therefore, I would attach the greatest importance to innovations that has macro effect, not innovations on a micro level, but on a macro level, which will have economy-wide effect. These are the kinds of things that we can do. India is a land of potential. India was once upon a time the most developed country in the world up till 1750. And today we may be nowhere near that, but the fact is our people have demonstrated all over the world that they are capable of the best work. And they are heads of corporations in the United States, where every American would give anything to become head of the corporation. In that competition, Indians have become corporation chiefs like of Microsoft and Amazon and so many others. And we have, even the Surgeon General now is an Indian. We have very good lawyers who are Indian. So therefore, my view is that TiE is the fittest organization which can create this atmosphere that India must now not think in terms of more investment alone, but must think in terms of how we can create a labor force which can create innovations. Today, the Japanese are about to release cars which are going to be based on hydrogen fuel cells, and that will mean that you would no more need crude oil from Saudi Arabia and other countries. and you won't be at their mercy of their prices going up and down. India can easily produce these hydrogen fuel cells. And so with all this potential, we should now think in terms of not $5 trillion anymore, but to become a developed country. And the three largest GDPs today in the world, one is the United States, the other is China, and third is India. And in the case of China, the model which took them this far is now exhausted. It can't proceed any further. And Trump seems to have caught the Chinese at the right moment by their throat. And therefore, if the most favored nation clause facility is not going to be available in the future of the Western world to China, China will be in great difficulty. We are under no such encumbrances. What we lack is a macroeconomic imagination, and that based on innovation to use what we call as our demographic dividend, that's our population. And so organizations like TiE, which create this kind of awareness, go in for startups. Indians are risk averters. We should now bring up our children to be a little more risk-friendly. Everybody wants a job, a steady job, and retire, and then with a gratuity and pension fund, probably buy a house and watch television for the rest of the thing. As your longevity is increasing, this is what you will be doing. So instead of that, to create like a Microsoft. We are today world's expert and software experts, but we haven't produced a single design of the software like Microsoft. So we must now motivate our people to think in these terms. And innovation is the key for India to grow. This is then $5 trillion in the next 5 years could be easily, in my opinion, $15 trillion by 2030 if we use the innovation route more skillfully. This is what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.